The winter storm hammered against the cabin walls with the fury of 1,000 demons, each gust of wind carrying ice crystals that clattered against the crude wooden shutters like skeletal fingers scratching for entry. Inside the one-room shelter, shadows writhed and twisted in the amber glow of a single oil lamp, and the flame dancing wildly with each violent shake of the structure. The bitter cold seeped through every crack and crevice, turning each breath into a visible puff of mist that hung in the air like ghosts of unspoken words. Chief Red Hawk knelt on the rough-hewn floorboards, his weathered hands moving with deliberate slowness as he approached the small figure huddled in the corner. The child, a girl whose golden hair was matted with soot and whose blue eyes held depths of dread. No 7-year-old should possess, pressed both tiny fists against her mouth, her entire body trembling with such violence that her teeth chattered audibly above the storm's howl. Anna Coleman's silent tears carved clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks as she rocked back and forth, clutching her threadbare toy rabbit so tightly that her knuckles had gone white as winter bones. Every few seconds, her wide eyes would dart toward the bedroom door, as if expecting some unspeakable horror to burst through the barrier at any moment. "Shh, little sparrow." Red Hawk whispered his voice, carrying the gentle cadence of prairie wind through tall grass. "The bad men are gone now. Their horses have carried them far from here." But Anna's response was to press herself deeper into the corner, her small shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. The acrid smell of distant smoke still clung to her torn dress, mixing with the metallic tang of blood that seemed to permeate everything in this harsh frontier world. "I'm scared," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's mournful wail. "I'm so scared, and I don't know what to do." Red Hawk's battle-scarred hands stilled completely. In 43 winters of warfare, negotiation, and survival on the Great Plains, he had learned to read the subtle languages of fear and desperation. This child's anguish was not born of the chaos outside. It was rooted in something far more personal and immediate. "Would you like me to tell you a story?" Red Hawk asked softly, settling cross-legged on the floor at a respectful distance. "When I was a boy, not much older than you, I was frightened by a great thunderstorm. My grandmother told me a story about how the thunder beings were not angry, but were protecting us from greater dangers we could not see." Anna's rocking slowed slightly, her tear-filled eyes focusing on his face. "What kind of dangers?" "Evil spirits that tried to steal the warmth from our hearts." Red Hawk continued his voice, taking on the rhythmic cadence of a traditional storyteller. "The thunder beings made loud noises to scare these spirits away, so that children like you and me could sleep safely in our beds." A tiny spark of curiosity flickered in Anna's eyes. "Did the story help when you were scared?" "It helped me understand that sometimes the loudest, most frightening things are actually trying to protect us," Red Hawk replied. "And it helped me learn that being scared is not shameful. It means you are wise enough to recognize danger." Outside, the retreating thunder of horse hooves was gradually swallowed by the storm's fury, punctuated by the occasional crack of gunfire, growing more distant with each passing moment. The outlaw raid had swept through the frontier settlement like a plague of locusts, leaving destruction and death in its wake. Yet Red Hawk could see in Anna's trembling form that her fear ran deeper than the violence that had just passed. When she whispered, "Please don't let her find me," he understood that this child's nightmare was far from over. The morning, 3 days earlier, had dawned clear and bitter cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry for miles across the frozen prairie. Red Hawk had been checking his trap lines along Willow Creek when he first noticed the smoke, not the thin, controlled wisps of a cooking fire, but the thick, black columns that spoke of destruction and death. The Coleman homestead had been prosperous by frontier standards carved from the wilderness through years of backbreaking labor and stubborn determination. Thomas Coleman, a man of 32, with hands like leather and eyes that held the quiet strength of those who had carved their lives from unforgiving land, had built something solid and lasting in this harsh country. Papa always said this land would test us. Anna had whispered during her first night in Red Hawk's cabin, her small voice barely audible above the crackling fire. But he said, if we were strong enough and worked hard enough, it would reward us too. Mary Coleman, barely 28, but already weathered by prairie winds and endless work, had transformed their simple cabin into a true home. Her kitchen garden had been the envy of neighboring settlements, and her preserves had won praise at the county fair 3 years running. Now it was nothing but charred timber and scattered dreams. Red Hawk had found Anna in the root cellar, curled beneath a pile of burlap sacks, like a small animal seeking shelter from a predator. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with soot and tears. But she appeared physically unharmed, a miracle given the thoroughness of the destruction above. I did what Papa told me, Anna had explained through chattering teeth as Red Hawk wrapped her in his warmest blanket. When I heard the first gunshot, I ran to the cellar and hid under the sacks. But I could hear everything. I heard Mama screaming my name, telling me to stay hidden. I heard Papa trying to fight them off. The ride back to his cabin had been conducted in watchful silence, Anna clinging to him with desperate strength while her enormous blue eyes scanned the horizon for threats. Red Hawk had fed her small spoonfuls of venison broth, speaking in the gentle Lakota words his grandmother had used to comfort frightened children. The words sound like music. Anna had observed during their second evening together, her first attempt at normal conversation. They make me feel safer somehow. The town of Broken Creek, 15 miles south through difficult terrain, had erupted in controversy the moment word spread of Anna's rescue. The settlement had grown from a simple way station into a community of nearly 300 souls, most of them struggling to eke out a living from land that seemed determined to kill them. That savages got no business keeping a white child. Jake Morrison had declared loudly in the saloon, his words carrying the weight of inherited prejudice. God knows what heathen rituals he's planning to perform on her. Jake was Sheriff Walt Morrison's nephew, a young man of 25, who had inherited his uncle's badge of authority, but none of his wisdom or restraint. His face bore the soft features of someone who had never known real hardship, and his eyes held the cruel gleam of those who mistake cruelty for strength. Jake's always been quick to judge, Amos Garrett had observed to Red Hawk during one of their conversations. Even as a boy, he liked to pick on anything smaller or different from himself. Getting that deputy badge just gave him official permission to be a bully. Mrs. Cora Finch stood at the center of the growing storm, her presence as commanding as a ship's figurehead, cutting through rough seas. A woman of 50-odd years with steel-gray hair, pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch the skin of her face, she had arrived in Broken Creek 5 years earlier with impeccable credentials and an air of moral authority that had immediately impressed the town's leadership. That poor, innocent child needs proper Christian guidance. Mrs. Finch had announced during the town meeting called to discuss Anna's situation, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. She's been traumatized by savage influences, and every moment she spends in that heathen's cabin compounds the damage to her pure soul. Her boarding house for orphan children occupied the largest building in town, aside from the church, a 2-story stone structure that spoke of permanence and respectability. The sign over the entrance proclaimed it the Finch Home for Christian Children, and smaller text below listed her credentials as a teacher and child care provider certified by the territorial government. Mrs. Finch sure knows how to talk pretty, Amos had commented with characteristic bluntness. But I've noticed her Christian children don't seem to do much laughing or playing. They move around town like little soldiers, all neat and quiet and scared to step out of line. But Anna's reaction to Mrs. Finch's name had been immediate and violent. The child had not spoken above a whisper since her rescue, flinching at sudden movements and cowering when adults approached too quickly. Yet she had formed an instant bond, with Red Hawk drawn to his calm presence and the gentle way he moved through the world. When she talks about me, her voice gets all sharp and mean. Anna had confided to Red Hawk after their third day together. It's like she's angry that I'm not where she thinks I should be. But I don't understand why she wants me so bad when she doesn't even know me. The demands for Anna's return had grown more insistent with each passing day. Delegations of townspeople had ridden out to Red Hawk's cabin, their faces set with righteous determination. Mrs. Finch had led these expeditions personally, her voice carrying the weight of community approval as she spoke about the child's need for proper civilized upbringing. You have no legal right to keep her, Mrs. Finch had declared during her second visit, her pale eyes fixed on Red Hawk with the intensity of a predator studying prey. I have the authority to care for orphan children in this territory, and I will not allow this innocent lamb to be corrupted by heathen practices. The child needs time to heal. Red Hawk had replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to command respect. She has suffered much, and healing cannot be rushed like the breaking of a wild horse. Mrs. Finch's response had been a cold smile that never reached her eyes. Healing comes through proper discipline and Christian guidance, not through indulgence of weakness. Every day she spends in this environment makes her recovery more difficult and my task more challenging. The other children at her boarding house appeared well fed and adequately clothed when seen in town. But Red Hawk had noticed subtle signs that troubled him. They rarely spoke unless directly addressed, and when they did, their words carried the careful cadence of those who had learned that spontaneous speech brought punishment. "I seen those kids at the general store," Amos had shared during one of their evening conversations. "They stand in perfect little lines, hands folded, eyes down. That ain't natural behavior for young ones. Hell, when I was their age, I couldn't stand still for 5 minutes without getting into some kind of mischief." The confession came on the fourth morning after the raid, as Red Hawk prepared a simple breakfast of cornbread and preserved venison. Anna had been sitting by the window, her small hands wrapped around a cup of warm milk, when she suddenly turned to him with an expression of desperate urgency that made his blood run cold. "Chief," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of secrets too heavy for a child's shoulders. "I need to tell you something real important, but I'm scared about what might happen if I do." Red Hawk set down his cooking implements and knelt beside her chair, careful to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. "You can tell me anything, little sparrow. I will listen with my whole heart, and I will believe every word you say." Anna's grip on her cup tightened until her knuckles went white. "It's about her. The lady with the mean eyes who keeps coming here. Mrs. Finch. She was there when the bad men came to our house." The words fell into the quiet cabin like stones, into still water, creating ripples of implication that spread outward in all directions. Red Hawk felt ice form in his veins, but he forced his expression to remain calm and encouraging. "Tell me what you saw, little one," he said gently. "Take all the time you need. You are safe here and no one can hurt you while I draw breath." Anna's eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting Mrs. Finch to burst through at any moment. "I was in the root cellar like Papa told me, but I could see through the crack in the door. The bad men came riding up real fast, but they didn't seem surprised about nothing. They knew exactly where to go, like someone had drawn them a map." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, as if the act of speaking was releasing pressure that had been building inside her for days. "Mrs. Finch was with them. She was riding a black horse, and she wasn't dressed like she usually is. She had on dark clothes, and she was pointing at our house with her finger, telling them where Papa kept the strongbox with our money." "What did she say to them?" Red Hawk asked, his voice remaining steady despite the rage building in his chest. "She said something about papers that needed to be destroyed before anyone could find them." Anna replied, her small face scrunched up with the effort of remembering. She said Papa had gotten too uppity, thinking he could take me away from her. But I don't understand what she meant. I was living with Mama and Papa, not with her. Red Hawk felt the world shift beneath him. If Anna's account was accurate, Mrs. Finch had not simply arrived after the raid, she had orchestrated it. The child's dread was not born of trauma alone, but of the knowledge that the woman demanding her custody was the same person who had murdered her parents. What happened after they went into the house? He asked, his heart pounding with the implications of what he was hearing. Anna's words came in a rush now, as if a dam had burst. They killed Papa first. He tried to fight them with his rifle, but there were too many. Then they went after Mama, and she was screaming my name, telling me to stay hidden no matter what I heard. Mrs. Finch went into the house while they were hurting Mama. She came out with a bunch of papers and she burned them right there in the yard. Tears streamed down Anna's face, but her voice remained clear and determined. After Mama stopped screaming, Mrs. Finch told the bad men to burn everything. She said it had to look like a regular Indian raid, nothing special. She said people needed to stay scared of your people so they wouldn't ask too many questions. The implications crashed over Red Hawk like an avalanche. How long after they left did Mrs. Finch return? Maybe an hour. Anna replied, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. She came back with some men from town, acting all surprised and sad. She found me hiding and told me she was going to take care of me. But when I tried to tell her about seeing her with the bad men, she grabbed my arm real hard and said terrible things would happen if I ever told anyone that story. Anna's small body shook with remembered fear. She said everybody already knew you were a bad Indian who stole children for awful purposes. And if I tried to tell the truth, they'd think I was lying to protect you. She said I belonged to her now, and I'd better get used to it, or she'd make sure I disappeared where nobody would ever find me. Red Hawk understood now why Anna had bonded with him so quickly. In a world where the primary adult authority figure in her life had betrayed her in the most fundamental way possible, he represented the only source of genuine protection she had encountered. She told everyone in town that you took me from her when she was trying to help. Anna continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. She said you were planning to sell me to other tribes, or worse. But I knew you saved me. You're the only grown-up who ever really listened to me without getting angry or telling me to be quiet. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Mrs. Finch's aggressive campaign to reclaim Anna was not motivated by genuine concern for the child's welfare. It was a desperate attempt to silence the only witness to her crimes. There's something else, Anna whispered, glancing around the cabin as if walls might have ears. Before the bad men came, Papa got a letter from a judge in the territorial capital. He was real happy about it, dancing around the kitchen and hugging Mama. He said it meant I could come home for good, that I wouldn't have to go back to Mrs. Finch ever again. Red Hawk felt another piece click into place. You had lived with Mrs. Finch before. Anna nodded, her expression growing sad. When Papa lost his job at the railroad and they couldn't feed me proper, they had to send me to live with her. She said she was helping our family, but she was mean to me. She made me work all the time, and she never let me play with the other children. She said I was lucky she was willing to take care of such a troublesome child. But your parents got you back, Red Hawk observed. Papa found work with a cattle drive, and Mama started selling her preserves to the army fort. Anna explained, her voice brightening at the memory. They saved up enough money to take care of me again. The judge said I could come home, that Mrs. Finch didn't have to be my guardian anymore. Red Hawk understood now. If Mrs. Finch had been Anna's legal guardian and had been forced to relinquish custody, she would have lost not only the government subsidies that came with caring for orphan children, but also her reputation as the town's primary child advocate. For a woman who derived her sense of power from controlling others, such a loss would be devastating. Now we need to find that letter. Red Hawk said, his voice carrying the iron determination of a man who had never broken a promise. and we need to get you somewhere safe while we prove what she's done." Anna looked up at him with eyes that held far too much knowledge for her age. "Will you really keep me safe, even if the whole town says you're wrong?" Red Hawk placed his hand gently on her shoulder, feeling the fragile bird bone structure beneath his palm. "I will defend you with my life, little sparrow. That is a promise I make not just to you, but to the spirits of your parents who died trying to keep you safe from evil." Red Hawk's plan was deceptively simple: escort Anna to the sheriff's office in Broken Creek, present her testimony to a neutral authority, and demand a proper investigation into the raid. Sheriff Walt Morrison was a fair man, despite his occasional lapses into frontier prejudice, and Red Hawk believed that Anna's detailed account would be compelling enough to at least delay any forced custody transfer until the truth could be determined. They set out at dawn, following the well-worn trail that connected Red Hawk's cabin to the main settlement. The morning air was crisp and clear, with no sign of the storm that had battered the region for the past week. Anna rode behind Red Hawk on his sturdy pinto mare, her small arms wrapped around his waist for security, her toy rabbit tucked safely between them. "Will the sheriff believe me?" Anna asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and anxiety. "I've never talked to a lawman before. Sheriff Morrison is a good man," Red Hawk replied, guiding the horse around a patch of treacherous ice. "He may not always understand our ways, but he believes in justice. Your words will carry weight with him, because children do not lie about such important things. But what if he thinks I'm just a scared little girl who doesn't know what she saw?" Anna pressed her grip, tightening around his waist. Red Hawk considered this question carefully. "Then we will ask him to look at the evidence. Truth has a way of revealing itself even when people try to hide it." For the first time since her rescue, Anna seemed almost relaxed, perhaps drawing comfort from the illusion of forward progress. The winter landscape stretched endlessly around them, stark and beautiful in its frozen perfection. Red Hawk allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. Perhaps the solution to their problem would be simpler than he had feared. The ambush came without warning as they crested a low hill overlooking the town. A dozen men on horseback burst from concealment among the scattered boulders, their faces masked by bandanas and their weapons drawn with deadly intent. Red Hawk recognized several of them. Despite their disguises, Jake Morrison's swagger was unmistakable, and Carl Hendrick's nervous fidgeting gave him away, despite the cloth covering his face. "Oh, let the girl go, you murdering redskin!" Jake Morrison shouted, his voice muffled by the bandana, but still carrying the arrogant authority of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "We know you killed the Colemans and stole their daughter for your savage rituals." Red Hawk's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle slung across his saddle, but he forced himself to stop. Any show of aggression would only confirm their suspicions and potentially endanger Anna. Instead, he raised his hands in a gesture of peace, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen air. "I found her at her family's burned homestead." Red Hawk called back, his tone reasonable and calm. "She was hiding from the raiders who killed her parents. I brought her to safety, nothing more." "Lies." Carl Hendrick spurred his horse forward, his face flushed with righteous anger above his improvised mask. "Mrs. Finch told us what you did. You and your savage friends murdered good Christian people and kidnapped their innocent daughter. She's lying." Anna's voice suddenly rang out clear and strong despite her fear. "Mrs. Finch was there when the bad men came. She told them where to find our money." The accusation hung in the frozen air like a thrown gauntlet. Jake Morrison's eyes narrowed above his mask, and Red Hawk could see the calculation taking place behind them. "The child's been tortured and threatened." Morrison declared, his voice rising to carry to all his followers. "She doesn't know what she's saying. Look at her, she's terrified out of her mind." "I know exactly what I'm saying. Anna shot back her small voice, carrying surprising strength. Mrs. Finch had on dark clothes, and she was riding a black horse, and she pointed at our house and told the bad men where Papa kept the strongbox. Tom Brady, the town's blacksmith, shook his head in disgust. Poor little thing's been so scared and confused she doesn't know truth from nightmares. That's what happens when savages get hold of innocent children. Red Hawk felt Anna's grip tighten around his waist, her breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. The child who had finally found the courage to speak her truth was being dismissed and discredited by the very people who claimed to want to protect her. "Please," Red Hawk said, directing his words toward Jake Morrison in the hope that family connection might inspire some restraint. "Take us to your uncle. Let Sheriff Morrison hear what the girl has to say. If I'm lying, he'll know it immediately." Jake's answer was to draw his pistol and point it directly at Red Hawk's chest. "No more words, Indian. Hand over the girl or die where you sit." The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Tom Brady lunged forward and grabbed Anna's arm, trying to pull her from the horse while she screamed in terror. Carl Hendricks swung a coiled rope at Red Hawk's head, the thick hemp whistling through the air like a striking snake. Jake Morrison's shot went wide as his horse shied at the sudden commotion, the bullet whistling past Red Hawk's ear to embed itself in a nearby pine tree. "Don't hurt him." Anna's voice rose above the chaos, her small fists striking out at her captors with surprising fury. "He saved me. He's the only one who listened." Red Hawk's response was swift and decisive. He drove his elbow backward into Brady's face, feeling the satisfying crunch of breaking cartilage as the man's nose exploded in a spray of blood. With his other hand, he caught Hendricks's rope and yanked hard, using the shopkeeper's own momentum to pull him from his saddle. But the numbers were against him. As he fought to maintain his grip on Anna, who was screaming his name in a voice that cut through him like a blade, hands seemed to grab at him from every direction. Someone's fist connected with his temple, filling his vision with dancing stars. Another blow landed in his ribs, driving the air from his lungs with explosive force. "You're making a mistake." Red Hawk roared, struggling to stay on his horse. "The child is in danger from the woman who wants her." His protests were lost in the mob's bloodlust. A rifle butt crashed into his skull, and he felt himself falling from the horse. The world spun wildly, colors bleeding together in a nauseating kaleidoscope. Through the haze of pain and confusion, he heard Anna's voice calling his name, growing more distant as rough hands carried her away from him. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Anna's pale face, looking back at him from the arms of her captors, her mouth open in a silent scream of abandonment and absolute dread. Red Hawk awoke to the taste of blood in his mouth and the sensation of snow melting against his cheek. The sun had moved significantly across the sky, suggesting he had been unconscious for several hours. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, and his ribs screamed in protest as he struggled to sit up. The mob had left him for dead beside the trail, apparently confident that exposure and his injuries would finish what their fists had started. But Red Hawk had survived worse than this. During the Battle of the Rosebud, he had crawled 5 miles through hostile territory with a bullet in his leg and a broken arm, driven by the knowledge that his people needed him. Anna needed him now, with the same desperate urgency. He forced himself to his feet, swaying slightly, as waves of dizziness threatened to topple him back to the ground. His pinto mare stood nearby, loyal and patient, despite the violence she had witnessed. The animal nickered softly as he approached, as if sensing his pain and determination. The ride back to his cabin took twice as long as usual, with frequent stops to rest and regain his equilibrium. But Red Hawk's mind was racing despite his physical injuries. If he was to rescue Anna and expose Mrs. Finch's crimes, he would need allies' evidence and a plan that accounted for the town's prejudices. Fortunately, he knew exactly where to find all 3. Amos Garrett lived in a dugout shelter carved into a hillside 2 miles from Red Hawk's cabin, a dwelling that was part fortress and part refuge. The 60-year-old former cavalry scout had lost his left arm to a Cheyenne war club, during the Indian Wars, ending his military career and leaving him with a deep mistrust of army politics and frontier justice. Red Hawk found Amos splitting kindling with a specially designed one-handed axe, his grizzled face creased with concentration. The old scout took one look at Red Hawk's battered condition and set down his tool with deliberate care. "Jesus Christ, Chief." Amos said, his voice gravelly from years of tobacco use and bitter frontier winters. "You look like you went 10 rounds with a grizzly bear that held a personal grudge. What in the hell happened to you?" "The town's prejudice happened," Red Hawk replied, accepting the chair Amos offered him. "They took Anna back to Mrs. Finch, and they nearly killed me in the process." Amos's weathered face darkened. "I warned you those bastards wouldn't listen to reason. Fear makes people stupid, and stupid people do stupid things." Red Hawk quickly summarized the events of the past few days, from Anna's rescue to her terrified confession to the ambush on the trail. Amos listened without interruption, his weathered face growing darker with each detail, occasionally spitting tobacco juice into the snow with increasing violence. "That Finch woman always gave me the creeps," Amos admitted when Red Hawk finished his account. "Something about the way she talks to children like she's training attack dogs instead of raising human beings. Hell, I've seen drill sergeants who were gentler with new recruits. I need to find proof of what she's done," Red Hawk said, accepting the cup of coffee Amos offered him. "And I need to get Anna away from her before she can cause any more harm." Amos nodded grimly, his single remaining hand clenching into a fist. "I'll help you. That little girl deserves better than being trapped with a murderer. Besides, I never did like bullies, especially ones who hide behind badges and Bible verses." He paused, studying Red Hawk's injuries with a professional eye. "But first, we need to get you patched up proper. You won't be saving anyone if you keel over from blood loss or crack your skull falling off your horse." While Amos cleaned and bandaged Red Hawk's wounds with the efficient skill of a man who had treated countless battlefield injuries, they developed a plan of action. The first priority was gathering evidence from the Coleman homestead. If Anna's story about a letter from the territorial judge was true, finding that document would provide crucial proof of Mrs. Finch's motives. The problem is that letter might have been destroyed in the fire. Amos pointed out, wrapping a bandage around Red Hawk's cracked ribs. "If this Finch woman was as thorough as you say, she wouldn't have left evidence lying around." Anna said her father hid important papers in a strongbox under the floorboards. Red Hawk replied, wincing as the bandage tightened. "If it was metal and buried deep enough, it might have survived the fire. And if it didn't, then we find other evidence," Red Hawk said firmly. "Evil this deliberate leaves traces. We just need to know where to look." The second priority was reconnaissance. They needed to know exactly where Anna was being held, what security measures were in place, and whether Mrs. Finch had additional allies beyond the townspeople who had participated in the ambush. As they prepared to leave, Amos whistled sharply. A large wolf dog emerged from the underbrush, its amber eyes intelligent and alert. The animal was a hybrid of domestic dog and gray wolf bred for loyalty and tracking ability. "Shadow here can track a scent through hell and back," Amos explained, scratching the animal behind the ears. "Got him from a trapper who owed me a favor. He's smart as a whip and loyal as the day is long." "There's something else?" Red Hawk said, his voice growing thoughtful. "Jake Morrison was leading that mob today. He seemed to know exactly when and where to ambush us. That suggests he's been watching my cabin or someone's been feeding him information." Amos spat into the snow. "Jake Morrison's a snake, but he's not particularly bright. If he's involved in this mess, someone else is pulling his strings." The ruins of the Coleman homestead presented a grim tableau in the afternoon sun. The fire had been thorough, reducing the family's possessions to ash and twisted metal. But Red Hawk's knowledge of frontier construction told him that certain items might have survived in the root cellar or other protected areas. They found the hidden strongbox exactly where Anna had described it, buried beneath the charred floorboards of what had been the main room. The metal container was blackened by heat and warped by the intense flames, but its contents were intact. Red Hawk's heart raced as he pried it open with his knife. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from both fire and moisture, was a collection of documents that told the story of Anna's custody battle. Letters from territorial officials, receipts for legal fees, and medical records painted a picture of a family fighting to regain custody of their daughter from a woman who had initially been granted temporary guardianship during their financial difficulties. "Look at this," Amos said, holding up a letter dated 8 months earlier. "It's from the Territorial Child Welfare Office. They're questioning Mrs. Finch about irregularities in her record-keeping." Red Hawk studied the document. "What kind of irregularities?" "Claims for children who can't be accounted for, receipts that don't match reported expenses, and complaints from visiting officials about the conditions at her facility." Amos read aloud. "Sounds like she's been running a profitable scam for years." The most damning document was a court order dated 6 months earlier, signed by Territorial Judge Marcus Whitman. The language was formal and precise, but the meaning was crystal clear. Custody of Anna Coleman was to be transferred immediately from Mrs. Cora Finch to her biological parents, Thomas and Mary Coleman, who had demonstrated their ability to provide adequate care and support. "This is it," Red Hawk breathed, holding the document up to the light. "This proves that Mrs. Finch no longer had legal authority over Anna. If she killed the Colemans to prevent them from taking custody, this is her motive." But even as they studied the documents, Red Hawk noticed something that made his blood run cold. Several of the official letters bore the seal of the county sheriff's office, and they were signed by J. Morrison, Deputy Sheriff. Amos, Red Hawk said slowly, "Look at this signature." Jake Morrison was handling the official correspondence about Anna's custody case. Amos squinted at the papers with his good eye. That son of a bitch. He knew about the judge's decision before anyone else did. He could have warned Mrs. Finch, given her time to plan. As if in response to his words, Shadow began barking excitedly from the other side of the burned cabin. The wolf dog had found something among the scattered debris, a piece of cloth that had been torn from a woman's dress and caught on a piece of twisted metal. The fabric was dark blue wool, expensive and well made, exactly the type of material Mrs. Finch favored for her severe outfits. More importantly, the cloth smelled strongly of lavender perfume, a scent that Red Hawk recognized from his uncomfortable encounters with Mrs. Finch. "She was here," Red Hawk said grimly. "But the question is, was she here during the raid, or did she come afterward to make sure there were no witnesses?" Their answer came from an unexpected source. As they prepared to leave the homestead, an elderly native woman emerged from the tree line, moving with the careful steps of someone who had learned to avoid drawing attention to herself. Red Hawk recognized her immediately, Singing Bird, a Lakota elder, who lived alone in the hills and rarely interacted with either whites or other Indians. The woman was considered touched by spirits, her mind damaged by some trauma in her youth that had left her speaking in fragments and seeming to exist partially in another world. "I saw the bad woman," Singing Bird said without preamble, her voice carrying the musical cadence of someone who spoke primarily in her native tongue. "She came with the killer men, pointed at the house with her stick finger." Red Hawk felt his blood turn to ice. "You saw Mrs. Finch with the raiders?" Singing Bird nodded emphatically, her weathered face creased with the effort of translating her memories into English. "She gave them shiny metal, told them where to find the strong box with the paper money. When the man and woman were sleeping forever, she went inside the burning house and took papers from the hiding place." "Did you see anyone else with her?" Amos asked. "Anyone from town?" "Young man with star metal on his shirt." Singing Bird replied, touching her chest where a badge would rest. He stayed back in the trees watching. When the burning was done, he rode away fast toward the town place. Red Hawk and Amos exchanged significant glances. The star medal was clearly a reference to a deputy's badge, and the description fit Jake Morrison perfectly. "We need to move fast," Red Hawk told Amos as they prepared to return to their horses. If Jake Morrison is involved this deeply, Anna's life is in immediate danger. But even as they rode away from the ruins of the Coleman homestead, Red Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The coordination required for Mrs. Finch's plan was too complex for a woman acting alone with a single accomplice. This was a well-organized operation that had been planned carefully and executed with military precision. The approach to Mrs. Finch's boarding house required careful planning and infinite patience. The building sat on a low hill overlooking the town, surrounded by open ground that would make a direct assault nearly impossible. But Red Hawk's years of warfare had taught him the value of observation, and he settled into position among the rocks with the stoicism of a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The boarding house itself was an imposing two-story structure built of locally quarried stone with narrow windows that resembled arrow slits more than domestic features. A heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands spoke of defense as much as hospitality, and the overall design suggested that Mrs. Finch had planned for the possibility of siege. Through his spyglass, Red Hawk could see movement within the building. Mrs. Finch herself appeared periodically in the windows, her severe profile unmistakable even at a distance. But it was the children who concerned him most. He counted at least 6 young people of varying ages, all dressed in identical gray clothing and moving with the mechanical precision of soldiers rather than the natural enthusiasm of childhood. "Those kids look like they're marching instead of walking," Amos observed, peering through his own spyglass. "I've seen prison work gangs with more spirit." As afternoon faded into evening, Red Hawk witnessed something that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Finch appeared at the back door, carrying what appeared to be a bundle of soiled clothing. She walked to a small wooden structure behind the main building, apparently a root cellar or storage shed, and disappeared inside. Moments later, he heard the sound of children crying, muffled by distance and thick walls. The sounds were not the normal tears of childhood disappointment, but the desperate sobbing of genuine fear. "She's keeping them locked up." Amos set his voice tight with controlled rage. "That's not discipline, that's imprisonment." Red Hawk watched through the spyglass as Mrs. Finch emerged from the cellar alone, brushing dust from her dark dress with the satisfied air of someone who had just completed an unpleasant but necessary task. She paused to look around the yard, her posture alert and suspicious, before returning to the main building. The crying continued for several minutes before fading to silence, a silence that was somehow more disturbing than the sounds of distress had been. "We need to see what's in there." Red Hawk set his voice, carrying the cold determination of a man who had seen too much suffering to remain passive. "If Anna is being held in that cellar, we need to know the layout before we attempt a rescue." As night fell, Red Hawk made his move. Using techniques learned from decades of wilderness survival, he approached the boarding house from downwind, his movements silent and precise. Shadow followed at a distance, ready to provide warning if guards or other threats appeared. The cellar door was secured with a heavy padlock, but Red Hawk's knife was sharp and the wood around the hasp was soft from years of moisture. He worked carefully, removing the screws that held the lock assembly in place, rather than trying to break the lock itself. The door opened with a soft creak that seemed thunderous in the night silence. Inside, the scene was even worse than he had imagined. The cellar had been converted into a makeshift prison with sleeping pallets arranged along the walls and a single bucket serving as a latrine. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and human waste, and the stone walls wept with moisture that had soaked through the children's meager clothing. 3 children huddled together in the corner, their faces pale and frightened in the moonlight that filtered through a small barred window. Anna was among them, still clutching her toy rabbit, but looking smaller and more fragile than ever. Her eyes widened when she saw Red Hawk, and she started to cry with relief. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, rushing to embrace him, despite the chains that bound her ankles. "I knew you wouldn't leave me." "Hawekchao, what has she done to you?" Red Hawk asked, gently kneeling to examine the crude shackles that held her while fighting back his rage at the sight of a child in chains. "She said if I told anyone about the bad men, she'd hurt Timothy and Sarah." Anna replied, gesturing to the other children. "She makes us work all day, cleaning and cooking and doing laundry for the whole house. If we don't do it perfect, she locks us down here without food." Timothy, a boy of perhaps 10, spoke up with the flat affect of someone who had learned to hide his emotions. "She gets money from the territory for taking care of us, but she spends it on herself and her friends. We get one meal a day, and it's usually just bread and water. She tells everyone in town that we're grateful and well cared for," added Sarah, the older girl, with the careful precision of someone who had learned to account for every detail. "But if we ever said different, she'd send us to the territorial prison where they hang children for lying." Red Hawk felt rage building in his chest like a physical force, but he forced himself to remain calm. "How many children are there?" "6 of us altogether," Sarah replied. "But Tommy got sick last month and she said he ran away. We found his body in the woods behind the house. She buried him in secret so nobody would ask questions about why the territory was still sending money for a dead boy. And there are others," Timothy added quietly. "Kids who come and go. Sometimes she trades them to people who come through town. Men who pay good money for children who won't be missed." The full scope of Mrs. Finch's crimes was becoming clear. This was not simply a case of child abuse or even murder for financial gain. She was operating a systematic program of exploitation using her reputation and position to trap vulnerable children in a cycle of forced labor and human trafficking. "We need to get you out of here," Red Hawk said. But even as he spoke, he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Mrs. Finch's voice carried clearly through the night air, apparently giving instructions to someone else. "Let's check the cellar," she was saying. "I heard something earlier, and I want to make sure our guests are secure for the night." Red Hawk had seconds to make a decision. But as the cellar door opened, he received a shock that changed everything he thought he knew about the situation. The man who entered behind Mrs. Finch was not one of her hired killers, or even a random townsperson. It was Jake Morrison, Sheriff Morrison's nephew, or the same man who had led the mob that attacked Red Hawk on the trail. But now he wore no mask, and his manner suggested complete familiarity with the cellar's layout and purpose. "Well, well," Mrs. Finch said, her voice carrying a coldness that made Red Hawk's skin crawl. "The noble savage comes to rescue his little prize. How utterly predictable." But it was Jake Morrison who spoke next, his voice carrying an authority that Red Hawk had never heard before. "You should have stayed away, Indian. Now you've seen too much to be allowed to live. Let the children go," Red Hawk said, rising to his feet with his hand moving instinctively toward his knife. "They've done nothing to deserve this treatment." Mrs. Finch laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the cold air. "Done nothing, they exist, Mr. Red Hawk. They consume resources, they require care, and they serve no useful purpose beyond the money they bring us." Red Hawk's mind raced as the implications became clear. "You're working together." Jake Morrison's smile was cold and predatory. "My dear aunt has been providing a valuable service to this territory for years. She processes orphan children, handles the paperwork, collects the government payments. I make sure nobody asks too many questions about her methods." Red Hawk felt the world shifting beneath his feet. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Finch said with obvious satisfaction. "Jake is my sister's boy. Family connections are so important in maintaining a successful business operation, don't you think?" The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Jake Morrison's position as deputy sheriff gave him access to territorial communications legal documents and the ability to influence official investigations. He had been feeding Mrs. Finch information about custody battles, helping her identify vulnerable children, and using his badge to legitimize her authority. But it's so much more than that. Jake continued his voice, taking on the tone of someone who enjoyed explaining his cleverness. We've been building a network. Other territories, other towns, other opportunities. Mrs. Finch here is just the beginning. Red Hawk felt ice in his veins. What kind of network? A profitable one. Mrs. Finch replied, There are people in this territory who will pay handsomely for healthy children. Mining operations need small hands for dangerous work. Railroad crews need expendable labor. And there are always those with other appetites. We've got operations in 3 territories now, Jake added proudly. Boarding houses, orphanages, church missions, all perfectly legal, all properly documented, and all very, very profitable. The magnitude of the horror was staggering. They weren't just talking about local child abuse, they were describing a widespread trafficking network that used legitimate institutions as cover for systematic exploitation. The Coleman custody case. Red Hawk said, understanding flooding through him. You told her about the judge's decision before the family received it. I told her that her profitable arrangement was about to end. Jake corrected. The Colemans were getting their daughter back, which meant one less monthly payment from the territory. But more importantly, it meant losing our most valuable asset. Anna's different from the other children. Mrs. Finch explained, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher explaining a lesson. She's intelligent, well-spoken, and comes from a good family. That makes her worth considerably more than the usual orphan trash we process. You're both sick. Red Hawk said, his hand tightening on his knife handle. These children are human beings, not merchandise. They're resources, Jake Morrison corrected. And resources exist to be exploited by those smart enough to recognize their value. Mrs. Finch gestured to the men behind her. Red Hawk now recognized them as the same outlaws who had murdered the Colemans, kept on the payroll for situations exactly like this. You see, Mr. Red Hawk, we had a very comfortable arrangement with the Coleman family. They were struggling financially, and I was able to provide care for their daughter while collecting payments from the territory. But then they became successful, Jake added. Their farm began producing better crops. Thomas found work with the railroad, and suddenly they decided they wanted their daughter back. That couldn't be allowed to happen. And so you had them killed. Red Hawk said, his voice heavy with disgust. We had a problem solved, Mrs. Finch corrected. The Colemans were obstacles to our operation. Their death served multiple purposes. It eliminated witnesses, it terrorized the community, and it gave us an excuse to expand our activities. The twisted logic was breathtaking in its cruelty. They had convinced themselves that murdering parents and enslaving children was simply good business practice, that human suffering was acceptable as long as it generated profit. You're monsters, Red Hawk said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. Jake Morrison drew his pistol, the metal gleaming in the lamplight. We're entrepreneurs, and dead Indians don't interfere with business. The confrontation Red Hawk had been dreading was about to begin, but now he understood the true scope of the corruption he faced. This was not just about one woman's greed or even a local conspiracy. It was about a systematic network of exploitation that reached across territorial boundaries and into the highest levels of law enforcement. The cellar erupted into violence with the sudden intensity of a lightning strike. Red Hawk's knife flew from his hand with practiced precision. But Jake Morrison was faster and more experienced than the hired killers. He twisted aside with military training, and the blade that should have found his throat instead buried itself in the wooden door behind him. Morrison's pistol boomed in the confined space, the bullet grazing Red Hawk's left shoulder and spinning him around. Mrs. Finch screamed something unintelligible, her lantern falling to the floor and plunging the cellar into near darkness. The flame caught the scattered straw, and within moments, smoke began to fill the underground chamber. "Kill him!" Mrs. Finch shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Kill him and burn this place down. We'll tell everyone the savages attacked us." But Jake Morrison was already moving with the smooth efficiency of someone who had killed before. He advanced on Red Hawk with the confidence of a predator who had cornered his prey, his weapon trained on the center of mass. "You know what I find most amusing about this situation," Morrison said conversationally, despite the chaos around them. "Uncle Walt actually thinks I'm investigating child welfare complaints. He has no idea that I've been running the most profitable business in the territory right under his nose." Red Hawk rolled behind a wooden crate, feeling warm blood spreading down his arm. The wound was painful, but not immediately life-threatening, and the bullet had torn through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. He could still fight, but his mobility was compromised. The hired killers were moving to flank him, and their weapons drawn, and their faces set with professional determination. These were not townspeople driven by prejudice and fear. These were experienced killers who understood their job and performed it with cold efficiency. "You want to know the best part?" Morrison continued, his voice carrying easily through the smoke-filled cellar. "After we kill you, we're going to expand the operation. More boarding houses, more orphanages, more opportunities. Your little rescue attempt will be remembered as the incident that proved we need better security measures." The fire was spreading rapidly now, fed by the dry wood and straw that filled the cellar. Red Hawk could see Anna's face in the flickering light, her eyes wide with terror as smoke began to fill her lungs. The other children were coughing and gasping, their small bodies unable to process the toxic air. "You're this way," Red Hawk shouted, grabbing a handful of dirt from the floor and throwing it at the nearest gunman's eyes. "Stay low and follow me." The distraction worked for a moment, but Jake Morrison was too experienced to be fooled by such a simple trick. His second shot splintered the wood of the crate Red Hawk was hiding behind, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. "You can't save them all, Indian," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had planned for every contingency. "Even if you somehow manage to kill me, there are others who will continue our work. This operation is bigger than any one person." Red Hawk's response was to lunge forward, tackling one of the hired killers around the waist and driving him to the ground. They grappled in the darkness, each man fighting for control of the weapon. The gun went off again, the bullet ricocheting off the stone walls and embedding itself in the wooden ceiling. But Mrs. Finch was not waiting for the outcome of the fight. Red Hawk could hear her voice growing more distant as she climbed the stairs, calling for help from the main house. Within minutes, the boarding house would be filled with her allies, and any chance of rescue would be lost. "Anna," Red Hawk called out through the smoke, "can you reach the keys?" The little girl, showing courage that belied her age, crawled toward Morrison's belt, where a ring of keys hung. Her small fingers worked frantically at the metal clasp while bullets flew overhead. "Got them!" she cried, beginning to unlock the shackles that held the other children. Red Hawk managed to break free from his opponent's grip and grabbed the man's own knife from his belt. The blade slid between the outlaw's ribs with a wet sound, and the man collapsed with a bubbling gasp. But Jake Morrison was still advancing, his pistol trained on Red Hawk's position. The deputy sheriff's face was set in a mask of professional determination, and his movement spoke of someone who had been in combat before. "You're a fool, Indian," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You think you can stop what we've built. This network spans 3 territories and involves dozens of officials. We have judges, sheriffs, territorial administrators all working together for mutual profit." The smoke was getting thicker now, and Red Hawk could hear the children coughing and crying as they struggled to breathe. Anna's voice rose above the chaos, calling out instructions to the younger children as she helped them toward the cellar entrance. "Now come on, Timothy, help Sarah with the little ones." "I'm coming, Anna." Timothy's voice was stronger now, as if the prospect of escape had given him new courage. With a final surge of strength, Red Hawk threw himself at Jake Morrison, accepting the inevitable gunshot in exchange for the chance to disarm his opponent. The bullet tore through his side, a burning agony that dropped him to his knees, but his momentum carried him forward. Morrison's gun flew from his hand, clattering across the stone floor and disappearing into the shadows. The two men grappled in the smoke-filled darkness, each fighting for survival with the desperate fury of cornered animals. Red Hawk's injuries were slowing him down, but Morrison was younger and stronger. The deputy sheriff managed to get his hands around Red Hawk's throat, his fingers digging into the flesh with murderous intent. "You should have minded your own business." Morrison hissed, his face inches from Red Hawk's. "Now you'll die knowing that I'm going to personally make sure every one of these children suffers before they're sold to the highest bidder." But Morrison had made a crucial mistake. In his focus on killing Red Hawk, he had forgotten about the other people in the cellar. Anna, driven by desperation and fury, grabbed a piece of burning wood from the fire and thrust it into Morrison's face. The deputy sheriff screamed, releasing his grip on Red Hawk's throat and stumbling backward. His hands flew to his face, which was now badly burned on one side. In his pain and confusion, he stumbled directly into the path of one of his own allies who had been trying to get a clear shot at Red Hawk. The gun went off, and Jake Morrison collapsed, shot by his own man in the chaos and confusion. His body hit the stone floor with a wet thud, and he lay still, his eyes staring sightlessly at the burning ceiling. "This way," Red Hawk shouted, gathering the children around him. "Stay low and follow me." They stumbled through the smoke toward the cellar entrance, Red Hawk's wounded body protesting every movement. Behind them, the fire was consuming everything, combustible, turning the underground prison into a furnace. They emerged into the night air, gasping and coughing, their clothes singed and their faces blackened with soot. But they were alive, and that was more than Red Hawk had dared hope for moments earlier. "Run," he told the children, pointing toward the tree line where Amos waited with their horses. "Get to the man with one arm. He'll keep you safe." But Anna clung to his good arm, her small face streaked with tears and soot. "What about you? You're hurt real bad." Red Hawk looked toward the main house, where lights were beginning to appear in the windows. Mrs. Finch's voice could be heard shouting orders, rallying her supporters for a final confrontation. The sound of approaching horses suggested that she had sent messengers to town, calling for additional help. "I have to stop her," Red Hawk said grimly. "She'll never let you live in peace as long as she's free." Even as he spoke, he could see Mrs. Finch herself emerging from the boarding house, carrying a rifle and accompanied by 3 men Red Hawk didn't recognize. Her face was twisted with rage, and she was pointing directly at him. "There," she screamed, her voice carrying clearly through the night air. "There's the murdering savage. Kill him before he can escape and ruin everything we've built." The final confrontation began with the thunder of gunfire echoing across the frozen landscape. Mrs. Finch's supporters opened fire immediately, their bullets kicking up dirt around Red Hawk's feet and whistling past his ears with deadly intent. He pushed Anna toward the trees and drew his backup pistol, a weapon he had hoped not to use. The odds were 4-1, and he was already wounded in 2 places. Blood loss was making him dizzy, and his left arm was nearly useless. But he had faced worse odds before, and he had never abandoned those who depended on him. "You cost me everything." Mrs. Finch shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "My reputation, my income, my entire network. All for a handful of worthless children who should have been grateful for the opportunities I provided." Red Hawk used the darkness and his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage, moving from cover to cover, while picking off Mrs. Finch's supporters one by one. His first shot dropped the man on the far left, spinning him around with a bullet to the chest. His second shot shattered the right arm of another attacker, sending the man's rifle flying into the snow. But Mrs. Finch was not simply standing by waiting for her hired guns to finish the job. As Red Hawk reloaded behind a wagon, she approached from his blind side, her own rifle trained on his position. "You understand nothing about the world, savage," she hissed her voice, carrying the cold certainty of someone who had convinced herself that her actions were justified. "These children were nothing before I gave them purpose. They had no future, no value, no reason to exist. They had lives." Red Hawk replied, his voice carrying across the frozen air. "They had dreams and hopes, the right to grow up free from fear. Dreams are luxuries for those who can afford them." Mrs. Finch shot back. "I gave them structure, discipline, and the chance to contribute to something larger than themselves. That's more than most orphans ever receive." The shots came simultaneously, muzzle flashes lighting up the night like competing lightning strikes. Red Hawk felt the bullet tear through his side, a burning agony that dropped him to his knees. But his own aim had been true. Mrs. Finch staggered backward, her rifle falling from nerveless fingers as blood spread across the front of her dark dress. She looked down at the wound with an expression of surprise, as if she had never considered the possibility of her own mortality. Then her legs gave out, and she collapsed in the dirt, her breath coming in short gasps. Red Hawk crawled toward her, his own injuries making movement difficult. He needed to know if she had any other allies, any other threats that might pursue Anna and the other children. But as he approached, he could see that her wound was mortal. The bullet had found her heart, and she was dying. "With the children," he gasped, his own voice growing weak from blood loss. "Where are the others? How many more are trapped in your network?" Mrs. Finch's eyes were growing glassy, but she managed a final bitter smile. "You think you've won. You think this changes anything. There are others, Indian. Others who understand that the weak exist to serve the strong. You've saved nothing. Tell me where they are." Red Hawk insisted, leaning closer. "Give these children a chance to go home." But Mrs. Finch's voice faded to a whisper, and then she was gone, her lifeless eyes staring up at the stars. Red Hawk felt no satisfaction in her death, only a profound weariness, and the knowledge that while this particular evil had been stopped, the world would continue to produce others like her. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him look up, expecting to see more of Mrs. Finch's allies arriving for a final assault. Instead, he saw Sheriff Morrison riding hard from town, his face grim with purpose. Behind him came a small group of townspeople, their expressions showing confusion and concern rather than hostility. "Jesus Christ," the sheriff breathed, surveying the scene of carnage. "What happened here?" Red Hawk struggled to his feet, using his pistol as a crutch. "Mrs. Finch was keeping children as slaves," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke and pain. "She murdered the Colemans to keep Anna, and your nephew was helping her run a trafficking network." Sheriff Morrison's expression was skeptical, but the evidence was hard to ignore. The burning cellar, the dead gunman, and the terrified children emerging from the woods all supported Red Hawk's account. Anna herself ran to the sheriff, her small voice carrying clearly in the night air. "He saved us," she said, pointing at Red Hawk. "The mean lady locked us up and hurt us, but he made her stop. And Jake was helping her. He was the one who told her about the judge's letter." My nephew, Sheriff Morrison's face went pale. "Jake was involved in this. He was running the whole operation," Red Hawk replied. "Mrs. Finch was just the front. Jake had connections to other territories, other operations. This was bigger than just Broken Creek." The sheriff looked around at the destruction, then back at Red Hawk. "You're going to need medical attention," he said finally. "And there's going to be a full investigation. But based on what I'm seeing here, I think we owe you more than just an apology." But the real climax was yet to come. The territorial hearing that followed would determine not just Red Hawk's fate, but the future of all the children who had been trapped in Mrs. Finch's system of exploitation. The courtroom in Broken Creek was packed to capacity 3 weeks later, with townspeople, territorial officials, and representatives from neighboring settlements all crowding in to witness the proceedings. Judge Marcus Whitman, the same man who had originally ordered Anna's return to her parents, presided over the hearing with the gravity of someone who understood that his decisions would have far-reaching consequences. Chief Red Hawk. Judge Whitman said, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. You stand accused of vigilante justice, destruction of property, and multiple homicides. How do you answer these charges? Red Hawk stood despite his injuries, his voice steady and clear. I answer that I protected innocent children from people who had murdered their parents and enslaved them for profit. I used only the force necessary to save lives, and I regret that more force was required. The prosecution, led by a territorial attorney who had traveled from Denver specifically for the case, began by calling witnesses who testified about Red Hawk's violent actions. They painted him as a dangerous savage who had used the cover of child rescue to commit murder and destruction. The defendant claims to have acted in the children's best interests, the prosecutor argued. But his actions resulted in the deaths of 6 people, including a duly sworn peace officer. No matter how noble his intentions, he cannot be allowed to escape the consequences of his crimes. But then the defense began presenting their case, and the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. Amos Garrett testified about the systematic abuse he had witnessed, describing the cellar prison and the terrified children who had been trapped there. I've seen a lot of evil in my time, Amos said, his gruff voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. But what that woman was doing to those children was the worst kind of cruelty. She was destroying their souls for profit. Singing Bird, despite her reputation for instability, provided crucial testimony about Mrs. Finch's presence during the Coleman raid. Her fragmented but detailed account of the murder scene left no doubt about Mrs. Finch's guilt. Bad woman came with killer men. Singing Bird said, her English broken, but her meaning clear. She showed them where to find the family's treasures. She watched when the man and woman were made to sleep forever. But the most powerful testimony came from the children themselves. Timothy and Sarah, the 2 who had shared Anna's imprisonment, described their treatment in detail. Their accounts of forced labor, starvation, and psychological abuse shocked the courtroom into silence. She said, we were lucky to have her. Timothy testified, his young voice steady despite his fear. She said no one else would want children like us, but all she wanted was the money the territory paid her to take care of us. She made us work from before sunrise to after dark. Sarah added, and if we didn't do everything exactly right, she'd lock us in the cellar without food or water. She said it was discipline, but it felt like punishment for being alive. The prosecution fought back by calling their own witnesses, including several townspeople who testified about Red Hawk's violent nature and his history of conflicts with white settlers. They presented evidence of his military background, suggesting that he was a dangerous warrior who had used his skills to commit murder. The defendant may have convinced himself that he was acting righteously. The prosecutor argued, but the law cannot excuse vigilante violence, no matter how sympathetic the circumstances. But then came the dramatic moment that would determine the outcome of the trial. A man Red Hawk had never seen before entered the courtroom, his face bearing the weathered features of someone who had spent years on the frontier. He wore the uniform of a territorial marshal, and his expression was grim with purpose. Your Honor, the marshal said, I request permission to present evidence relevant to this case. Judge Whitman looked surprised but nodded. Proceed, Marshal. The marshal opened a leather satchel and withdrew a collection of documents. 3 weeks ago, acting on information provided by Sheriff Morrison, territorial authorities raided boarding houses and orphanages in 3 different territories. We found evidence of a systematic trafficking network that involved dozens of officials and hundreds of children. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers as the marshal continued. Jake Morrison was not just a local corrupt official. He was the coordinator of a network that stretched from Colorado to Wyoming, involving judges, sheriffs, territorial administrators, and civilian contractors. Children were being bought and sold like livestock, used for forced labor and worse. The marshal held up a thick file of documents. These are records we found in Jake Morrison's personal effects. They detail the locations of other operations, the names of officials involved, and the financial records of the entire network. The profits were enormous, and the scope of the abuse was staggering. Judge Whitman examined the documents with growing horror. How many children were involved? Based on the records, at least 300 over the past 5 years. The marshal replied. And those are just the ones we can document. The actual number is probably much higher. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The scope of the conspiracy was far beyond what anyone had imagined, and it cast Red Hawk's actions in an entirely different light. Without the defendant's intervention, the marshal continued. Avant, this network would have continued operating indefinitely. His actions not only saved the children in Mrs. Finch's facility, but they exposed a criminal enterprise that was destroying lives across multiple territories. The prosecution's case began to crumble as the evidence mounted. Witness after witness testified about the good character of the rescued children, their obvious relief at being free, and their clear affection for Red Hawk. But the most powerful moment came when Anna herself took the stand. Her small voice carried clearly through the packed courtroom as she described the night of her parents' murder and the weeks of abuse that followed. Mrs. Finch was there when the bad men came. Anna said, her eyes fixed on Judge Whitman's face. She told them where to find our money, and she burned the papers that said I could live with Mama and Papa. When Chief Red Hawk found me, I was scared to tell anyone because she said nobody would believe me. The child's composure began to crack as she continued. But he listened. He was the only grown-up who ever really listened to me. He made me feel safe, and he kept his promise to protect me. Tears streamed down Anna's face as she finished her testimony. I don't want to go to another boarding house. I don't want to go to strangers. I want to stay with Chief Red Hawk. He's the only family I have left. The courtroom was silent for a long moment, and the weight of the child's words hanging in the air like a prayer. Then Judge Whitman spoke his voice, carrying the authority of both law and conscience. This case presents us with a fundamental question about the nature of justice, he said. Are we bound by the letter of the law, even when that law has been corrupted by those sworn to uphold it? Or do we have a higher obligation to protect the innocent, even if that protection requires us to act outside the bounds of conventional legal procedure? The judge's decision was swift and decisive. All charges against Red Hawk were dismissed, and he was formally commended for his courage in exposing the trafficking network. Mrs. Finch's estate was seized to provide compensation for the families of her victims, and new regulations were implemented to prevent similar abuse in the future. But the most important decision concerned Anna's future. With her parents dead and Mrs. Finch's custody claim revealed as fraudulent, the question of her care remained unresolved. I want to stay with Chief Red Hawk, Anna said firmly when asked about her preferences. He's the only one who believed me when I was scared. The request was unprecedented, but Judge Whitman had been moved by the evidence of the bond between them. This is highly irregular, he warned. There will be conditions requirements for education and regular visits from territorial officials. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny, Chief Red Hawk? Red Hawk looked down at Anna, seeing in her eyes the same determination that had carried him through decades of conflict and survival. I am prepared for whatever is necessary to give her a safe and loving home. The judge's gavel fell with finality, and Anna's future was decided. She would remain with Red Hawk under the protection of both territorial law and Lakota tribal sovereignty. As the decision was announced, Anna burst into tears of joy and ran to embrace Red Hawk. The sight of the small girl clinging to her protector, both of them crying with relief and happiness, brought tears to the eyes of everyone in the courtroom. It was a moment of pure emotional catharsis, a reminder that sometimes justice and compassion could triumph over prejudice and corruption. The weeks that followed the trial were a time of healing and adjustment for everyone involved. Red Hawk's physical wounds mended slowly, leaving him with permanent scars and occasional weakness in his left arm. But the emotional healing took longer, as both he and Anna struggled to process the trauma they had endured. Anna's nightmares gradually became less frequent, though she still clutched her toy rabbit whenever thunder reminded her of gunfire. Under Red Hawk's patient guidance, she began to speak more freely about her experiences processing the trauma through storytelling and traditional Lakota healing practices. "The dreams are getting better," Anna confided to Red Hawk one evening as they watched the sunset from their favorite hill. "I still see Mrs. Finch sometimes, but now I remember that she can't hurt me anymore." Bad dreams lose their power when we share them with people who care about us. Red Hawk replied, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had faced his own demons. "The spirits of your parents are watching over you, and they are proud of your courage." The other children from Mrs. Finch's boarding house were gradually placed with families or institutions that could provide proper care. The territorial government had implemented new screening procedures and regular inspections to prevent similar abuse. Timothy and Sarah were adopted by a farm family outside Broken Creek, where they slowly learned to trust again. "I heard Timothy actually laughed yesterday," Amos reported during one of his visits. "First time anyone's heard him make a joyful sound since he was rescued. Kid's got a lot of healing to do, but he's getting there." The town of Broken Creek itself underwent a transformation. The revelation of the trafficking network had shattered many assumptions about moral authority and proper behavior. Citizens who had previously viewed Native Americans with suspicion began to question other prejudices, recognizing that wisdom and compassion were not limited by race or culture. Sheriff Morrison, deeply ashamed of his nephew's role in the conspiracy and his own failure to detect the corruption, worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with the local Lakota population. He established new protocols for investigating reports of child abuse and created a system for cross-cultural cooperation in law enforcement. "I should have seen the signs," Sheriff Morrison admitted to Red Hawk during one of their meetings. "My own nephew was running a criminal empire right under my nose, and I was too blind to notice." "Evil is often hidden behind familiar faces," Red Hawk replied. "What matters is that we learn from our mistakes and work to prevent them from happening again." The territorial government's investigation into the trafficking network revealed connections to similar operations across the frontier. Dozens of fake orphanages were shut down, hundreds of children were rescued, and dozens of officials were arrested. The reforms came too late for many victims, but they ensured that such systematic abuse would be much harder to organize in the future. Red Hawk's own healing was more complicated. His physical wounds mended but left him with permanent limitations. His left arm never regained full strength, and his side ached whenever storms approached. More challenging were the emotional burdens he carried. The knowledge that he had killed multiple people, even in defense of innocent children, weighed heavily on his conscience. "I keep thinking about Jake Morrison," Red Hawk confided to Amos one evening. "He was evil, but he was also someone's nephew, someone's son. His death weighs on me, even though I know it was necessary." "That's what makes you different from him," Amos replied. "You feel the weight of taking a life, even when it's justified. That's not weakness, that's what makes you human." But Anna's presence in his life provided a constant reminder of why the violence had been necessary. Her laughter echoing through the cabin, her questions about Lakota culture and history, her simple trust in his protection, these things gave meaning to the sacrifices he had made. "I want to learn more about my new family," Anna said one day using the Lakota words Red Hawk had taught her. I want to understand the stories and the songs and the way of seeing the world. Red Hawk smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Then we will learn together, little sparrow. There is much wisdom in the old ways and much healing in understanding our place in the great circle of life. 2 years after the events at Mrs. Finch's boarding house, Red Hawk stood on a hill overlooking the town of Broken Creek, watching the smoke from evening cooking fires rise into the autumn sky. Anna, now 9 years old and confident in her place in the world, sat beside him, braiding grass stems with the patience she had learned from Lakota grandmothers. "Tell me the story again," she said, her voice carrying the request that had become their evening ritual. "Tell me about the day we became family." Red Hawk smiled, settling back against the warm stone where they often came to watch the sunset. "Which part would you like to hear?" "The part about how you knew I was telling the truth, even when the grown-ups didn't believe me." "I believed you because children rarely lie about being afraid." Red Hawk said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned wisdom through suffering. "Fear is too important to fake and too dangerous to ignore." Anna nodded solemnly, then brightened with the resilience that had carried her through the darkest times. "And now I'm not afraid anymore. Well, not most of the time. Being brave doesn't mean never being scared," Red Hawk replied. "It means doing what's right, even when you are scared." The transformation had been remarkable to witness. The terrified child who had whispered her fears in a smoke-filled cabin had grown into a confident young girl who spoke her mind clearly and defended others who could not defend themselves. Her voice, once silenced by fear, had become a powerful tool for justice. Anna had expressed interest in becoming a teacher inspired by her experiences with both positive and negative adult authority figures. She wanted to help other children who might be trapped in dangerous situations to be the kind of grown-up who listened when young people spoke about their concerns. "I want to be like you," she had told Red Hawk one evening. "Someone who believes children when they say they're scared." The territorial government's final report on the trafficking network had been made public the previous month, documenting the full extent of the operation and the reforms that had been implemented. Red Hawk had been officially commended for his role in exposing the crimes, and his guardianship of Anna had been made permanent without further conditions. But the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. Judge Whitman, the man who had originally ordered Anna's return to her parents, had traveled to Broken Creek specifically to meet with Red Hawk. The conversation had been brief, but profound. "I've been thinking about your case." The judge had said, his weathered face serious. "Not just the legal aspects, but the human ones. You showed more wisdom and compassion than our entire legal system managed to produce." Red Hawk had accepted the compliment gracefully, but his response had been characteristic. "I did what any parent would do to protect their child." The judge had nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. "That's exactly my point. You became her parent not through law or blood, but through choice and love. That's the strongest foundation any family can have." As the sun set over the Great Plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Red Hawk felt a deep sense of completion. The violence and trauma that had brought him and Anna together had been transformed into something healing and hopeful. But the final surprise came as they prepared to return to their cabin. Anna reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object that Red Hawk hadn't seen in months, her old toy rabbit, worn and faded, but still recognizable. "I've been carrying him with me," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But I think it's time to let him help someone else." Red Hawk understood immediately. They walked to the small cabin that had been built beside their own, where 3 new children were staying, refugees from another boarding house that had been shut down as part of the ongoing investigation. Inside, they found the youngest of the children, a boy of perhaps 5, sitting alone in the corner. He looked up at them with eyes that held the same haunted expression Anna had once carried. Hi, Anna said, kneeling beside the boy. What's your name? Tommy. The boy whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm Anna, she replied, holding out her toy rabbit. This is my friend. He's very brave, and he's good at keeping scary things away. Would you like to hold him? Tommy's eyes widened as he accepted the worn toy, clutching it against his chest, with the same desperate grip Anna had once used. There's going to be a lady who comes to visit tomorrow. Anna continued, her voice taking on the gentle tone Red Hawk had used with her. She's going to ask you some questions about where you came from and what happened to you. It's okay to be scared, but it's also okay to tell the truth. The grown-ups here will listen to you, and they'll believe you. Red Hawk watched from the doorway as Anna continued talking to the boy, sharing her story and offering comfort. The child, who had once been too frightened to speak above a whisper, was now using her voice to heal others. Will you tell me a story? Tommy asked, his voice growing slightly stronger. Anna smiled, settling cross-legged on the floor beside him. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who was very scared. She had to live with a mean lady who hurt children, and she didn't think anyone would believe her if she told the truth. But then she met a kind man who listened to her, and he helped her find her courage. As Anna continued her story, Red Hawk felt tears prick his eyes. The circle was complete. The child who had been saved was now saving others, using her own experience to bring hope to those who needed it most. That night, as Red Hawk listened to the sounds of his expanded household settling into sleep, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. Mrs. Finch's crimes had been terrible, but they had also revealed the capacity for courage and compassion that existed in ordinary people. The story that had begun with a whispered cry for help had become a testament to the power of believing in the voices of the vulnerable. Anna's simple words, "I'm scared of her," had exposed a network of exploitation and launched a series of reforms that would protect countless other children. But more than that, they had created a family bound not by blood or law, but by the unbreakable bonds of love and mutual protection. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all, not the defeat of evil, but the triumph of hope over fear, love over hatred, and the enduring truth that one person's courage to listen can change the world for a child who desperately needs to be heard. As Red Hawk drifted off to sleep, he could hear Anna's voice drifting from the next room, no longer whispering in fear, but speaking confidently as she continued her story to the new children in their care. The girl who had once been too frightened to speak above a whisper had found her voice, and she was using it to light the way for others who were just beginning their own journeys from terror to trust. The circle was complete, the story was finished, and the future stretched ahead, filled with infinite possibility.